United States President Donald Trump, who has recently been vehemently criticized for delaying efforts to control the spread of coronavirus in his country, has announced that the states are cutting off funding for the World Health Organization. In fact, the American president is not alone in his criticism of the organization. There are two main aspects. The first is unhealthy, according to critics, the organization's relations with China, which turned into problems amid an outbreak of coronavirus in the country. So, although Trump announced that WHO is trying to hide the extent of distribution, it is more likely that the organization's leadership could simply blindly trust the Chinese authorities. For example, the media reported on China's attempts to silence the doctors who were the first to find strange pneumonia in Wuhan in December 2019, then there was information about hiding the real numbers of cases. Mathematical models were also not in favor of China. For example, studies by the team of a prominent British epidemiologist Neil Ferguson by early February showed that the number of infected people documented in the Middle Kingdom can be as little as 5% of the real, and now. Especially against the backdrop of numbers on the number of cases in Europe and the US, as well as population density in the Middle Kingdom, there really is reason to doubt the Chinese miracle of getting rid of the virus. In addition, in mid-January, when the virus began to cross the borders of states, China talked about controlled spread, as well as the lack of evidence that COVID-19 is transmitted from person to person, and the WHO trusted the Chinese, by numbers, and by not too high danger of distribution. Critics attribute this to China's increasing influence on the organization's leadership. Personally, the WHO state practically does not sponsor. In 2019, the country donated only $85,000, but it may have other leverage. The pharmaceutical company Hualan Biological Bactrin of Xinjiang alone transferred about $500,000 to WHO last year. A powerful lobby at WHO and traditional Chinese medicine, the organization suddenly began to promote it in 2018, and in May 2019, it completely published a comprehensive medical directory dedicated to. And in 2020, when calls began to be made in China to use traditional medicine to combat COVID-19, WHO removed the warning on their account from the local version of its website. Moreover, the current pandemic may be just an unpleasant side effect of the very Chinese medicine. Critics have repeatedly noted that the numerous wet markets of the country where they sell, primarily for medical consumption, of various wild animals, lead not only to mass poaching and extermination of species, but also to the spread of zoonotic viruses and bacteria. In Wuhan, the first cases of infection were associated with one of these markets. And the second reason for criticism is slowness. Moreover, this aspect can be closely related to the first. The main complaint here is that WHO, naively trusting in Chinese statements and figures, has too long delayed the declaration of an emergency of international importance. The WHO emergency mode was announced on January 30, and at the same time, the head of the organization, Tedros Ghebreyesus, quite loudly praised China's measures, calling them a new standard of action for such situations. At the same time, it's difficult to blame WHO and Ghebreyesus for bias. The organization had to trust China, it simply had no other choice. The Chinese authorities simply did not allow an international group of scientists to Wuhan until mid-February. The result of the visit, nevertheless, was the first comprehensive report on 55,000 patients, published at the end of February. It was he who clarified the methods of transmission of the virus, and the main symptoms of the disease. But nevertheless, the current attacks on WHO by the United States, though not unfounded, are more like hysteria. The authorities of the countries of the world are not at all obliged to listen to the recommendations of WHO. The organization generally has few levers of influence on anyone, and even if we assume that the announcement of the emergency mode on January 30 was a direct signal to action, it turns out that the United States was very late in responding by itself. As of January 30, there were 7 cases in the United States, so no one in the White House thought about the impending scale. Trump introduced the emergency mode only on March 13, 43 days after the announcement of WHO. A month later, the organization turned into an enemy whose activities need to be investigated, and funding should be stopped. Trump may have reason to stop transferring money to organizations, but now is not the best time for such proceedings, rightly said UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. The World Health Organization is a UN structure, so member states pay small contributions to its budget. However, their share is not high, 17% of the total amount of money available in one form or another by WHO. But 77% of them are voluntary contributions, and from anyone, countries, companies, funds, for example. The U.S. refusal from financing can really seriously affect WHO in some perspective. The organization builds its work through strategic planning. Now the 2019 to 2023 plan is in place, which involves spending about $14 billion on various projects around the world. The WHO budget is imposed in 2-year cycles, and according to the current organization has approximately $6 billion in turnover. Almost all of this money has already gone or is now going to various programs to improve the life and health of people in different parts of the planet. The United States is now the main donor to WHO. For 2018-2019, the country has pledged to transfer $893 million, which is almost 15% of $6 billion. The United States is now the main donor to WHO. For 2018-2019, the country has pledged to transfer $893 million, which is almost 15% of $6 billion. 553 of them have already gone into business. Most of them are for WHO programs in the Middle East and North Africa. Critics of Trump's decision to suspend funding have already noticed that this can only play into the hands of the Chinese lobby at WHO and, accordingly, worsen the U.S.'s position in global healthcare. The second largest amount of money transferred to WHO is Bill Gates. More precisely, his joint fund with his wife Melinda. He undertook to transfer $530 million. They will go mainly to African projects. The third is again Bill Gates. This time, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization (Gavi), which he founded, brings together various private and government organizations. WHO will receive $370 million, 8%, from Gavi. The top 10 contributors also include the United Kingdom 8%, Germany 6%, and the World Bank 3%.